From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. On Friday afternoon, a former Israeli minister tweeted, "The coming weeks will shape the coming decades in the Middle East." By the early hours of Saturday morning, a tectonic shift was already underway as America and Israel launched a war on Iran.
This regime will soon learn that no one should challenge the strength and might of the United States Armed Forces.
The President of the United States of America made it clear that this wasn't about nuclear negotiations. He was calling for regime change.
To the great, proud people of Iran, I say tonight that the hour of your freedom is at hand. Stay sheltered, don't leave your home. It's very dangerous outside. Bombs will be dropping everywhere. When we are finished, take over your government. It will be yours to take. This will be probably your only chance for generations.
Within hours, Donald Trump was back on social media announcing that the supreme leader of Iran was dead.
There is major breaking news at this hour. Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, is believed to have been killed in the attack in Iran.
In Iran, despite initial denials from the government, the news was eventually announced on state TV by an emotional presenter.
حضرت آیت الله العظما سید علی حسینی خامنه‌ای در راه سربلندی حرم جمهوری اسلامی.
While some in Iran have been grieving the death of the Ayatollah, elsewhere, ordinary Iranians celebrated, dancing on the streets. But will that really be enough to trigger regime change in Iran? And how will this play out across the region, where bombs are currently hitting countries around the Gulf and beyond? The story today, the Iran strikes explained.
We were woken up around 8 a.m. local time with air raid sirens, which was quite surprising. Everyone went down to the shelters to find them locked. It turns out the first siren was a warning that Israel is at war. That was how they announced it to the public, so that people could prep.
That's Gabrielle Weiniger, the Times Israel correspondent who covers the region and its wars from Tel Aviv.
You saw people start to leave the cities, packing their bags, talking about where they were going to go. So it's a very quiet Tel Aviv. The usually bustling boardwalk is empty. There are no surfers in the sea, even though surf is up. Most things are shut because the bombardment is frequent. Last night around 2 a.m, there was a very heavy barrage and one fell in central Tel Aviv in a very cosmopolitan area. It was a bit like the Covent Garden of Tel Aviv. And to see that area turned into almost like a war zone, an entire block is just skeletal. And to see that is always quite shocking in a city where you've lived for, over a decade.
Gabby, it's been a manic weekend. Just talk us through what's been happening over the last 2 days.
The US and Israel coordinated on a strike from the very get-go. This has been a completely joint operation, so that's quite different from what we saw in June, where we saw Israel attack Iran and then the US join in and strike those 3 nuclear sites and kind of end the war. This is very different. And this is a plan that's been in motion really for decades, you can say, because Israel is deeply embedded in the Iranian network. They have placed themselves and their intelligence agencies all over Iran, and I think they used a lot of their intel to organize their opening gambit, which was extremely strong and caught Iran completely off guard. They hit many, many targets, particularly, let's talk about the ace card for Israel, which was killing the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. He's the top decision maker He's the spiritual leader of Iran. He's in charge of absolutely everything. He is Iran. He is the figurehead. He's been leading for over 35 years. So his assassination in full daylight, may I say, that is very surprising. I think Iran would have expected, if anything was going to happen in the middle of nuclear talks, it would happen at night. But that was a surprise operation. 30 bombs were dropped on his compound. Clearly, they had intel that reportedly came from the United States where top leaders were all meeting together. Senior leaders, senior military leaders and political leaders. And they were all killed at once. It was a very unique opportunity. And I think that the US and Israel said, OK, now's the time to start.
It is remarkable. We're sort of getting a list of some of the high-ranking IRGC people, some of the politicians, and of course the Ayatollah, who have been effectively decapitated in these strikes. The war is already spreading, though. The Iranians did say it would turn into a regional conflict. Just tell us where else bombs are going off at the moment.
Oh, Iran's hit back quite widely, and I think that was also took people by surprise, and analysts are asking, was that the war plan, or has central command just completely fallen apart and they're just shooting what they have where they can?
Because it's not just military bases, they are sort of hitting citizens in different countries.
That's right, and I think it's countries that aren't really used to having such a conflict. 4 Gulf Arab countries that host American military bases. We've got Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and Dubai, and the UAE. They've been hitting them with kamikaze drones, so they have quite a heavy impact, especially when you see those videos of the drones hitting the hotel, for example, in Dubai. It's quite shocking to see that. Iran also fired 2 missiles today in the direction of Cyprus, where the UK has military bases. So it's not just Israel taking the brunt of the fire this time.
You mentioned that there are reports coming in that they've been bombing British bases in Cyprus. We know that the UK has shot down an Iranian drone. So we're effectively involved in this in a defensive capacity at least. Gabby, just take us back to how on earth we got here. Let's start with the negotiations that have been taking place over the last few weeks. What do we know about how far they went and why they broke down?
I think as journalists, we found it quite difficult to believe in the talks over Iran's nuclear program and give them credence and listen to what was coming out of those talks, what was being leaked, that they were successful, that they were going well. And I think that the plan was always to topple the regime while it was weak. And this plan has been in the making for a long time, and it's not been a massive secret because of the massive buildup of US military hardware in the region. Trump has been constantly saying since January, since the Iranian uprising, which killed thousands of people, help is on the way. We are going to do something about this. There was new talks set for tomorrow, for Monday, in Vienna on technical issues. So it almost looked like things had been hammered out, and Iran had offered enough to the US on its nuclear program for the US to say, yes, we'll have a new deal after US President Donald Trump tore up the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in his first term.
U.S. President Donald Trump on Tuesday announced he would pull the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear agreement.
It is clear to me that we cannot prevent an Iranian nuclear bomb under the decaying and rotten structure of the current agreement.
And reimpose those economic sanctions, which essentially led to the current economic grievances of the Iranian people today.
Were these talks effectively a sideshow? Because, we have had the foreign minister of Oman, who was helping to negotiate between the different parties, coming out saying real progress was being made, and he's aghast at the action that America and Israel have taken. Were the talks just a distraction?
Yes. The writing was on the wall for war. While Oman might have said the negotiations were doing well, and the US had a bar that I think Iran was never really going to reach. And I think there was an understanding that there were massive gaps there on key issues. The US was saying, let's not just talk about your nuclear program. Let's also talk about your ballistic missile program. Let's also talk about your proxies. Let's talk about ending enrichment and transferring your uranium stockpiles. Those are things Iran has drawn a red line on previously. And there wasn't really a clear sign that Iran was going to destroy its nuclear sites. That was another one. There wasn't a clear sign that Iran was going to capitulate on something that the Supreme Leader had put as a pillar of their so-called deterrence policy, and the right for Iran to peacefully enrich uranium, which is what he constantly said it was for. Nobody believed him, but that's another matter.
And Gabby, we know that the Ayatollah now has been killed. Just remind us a bit about sort of his position in the country, and is that enough to change regime?
That's the million-dollar question. Now that he's dead, who will take over? He was the face of the regime for a very long time, in power since 1989. He was part of the opposition and part of the underground to overthrow the Shah in 1979. So he was very much became the establishment. So the question is now, who's going to take over? There are analysts who say that the next ruler won't be a clerical one. It will be somebody more of a pragmatist. Most of the top brass has been assassinated, but an interim leadership council has already been appointed, where we've got the president, the head of the judiciary, and a jurist from the Guardian Council who are going to assume responsibility basically until a new leader is elected. So while the council's been established and formed today on Sunday, it's not clear who they're going to elect to succeed the supreme leader at this moment.
Gabby, how is this being seen in Israel at the moment? Do they think this will be a protracted war? Are we expecting Israel and America to be in it for the long haul? Or is this something that people expect will be over in a few weeks' time?
We're in such early days that we can only assume and understand that Israel and America have a war plan, at least for the next week or two, where they plan to take out certain key sites, for example, nuclear sites or missile launchers. I think it's interesting to look at how Israel sees it, because back in June, I think many Israelis were annoyed to go through what they went through and not see the end of the regime. Because of that, I think there's a feeling of now we're in it and let's just go through it. They want to see the end of the regime. They want to see the end of their arch enemy, who has been a sponsor of terror around the world for decades. They've sponsored the proxy forces in Lebanon, who have been Iran's front line of defense for years, having weapons pointed at Israel for a very long time. We've had Hamas as well, and Iraqi Shia militia, and then there's the Houthis. Interestingly, none of those parties have really got involved at all in this current war. So I think some of their contingency plans haven't been enacted, but certainly Israel's prepared for the coming weeks ahead in the hopes that this will lead to a new Middle East. So that's what everyone's watching at the moment.
Well, I wasn't completely surprised. Here at home, we were trying to work out, my wife and I, whose parents were Iranian, whether it was going to be, Saturday night or Sunday morning, so to speak. And it turned out to be Saturday morning. But we were pretty clear that something was going to happen this weekend.
The repercussions of these strikes are already proving to be complex and wide-ranging. So we turn to a man who understands both the region and how this will play out on the global stage.
I'm Peter Westmacott. I used to be a British diplomat for many years, and I was ambassador in Turkey and France and the United States, and I began my career as a Persian-speaking political secretary in the British Embassy in Tehran before the revolution in the 1970s.
Iran was a very different place back then. Just describe what it was like and how different it is to Iran now.
It was a fun place to be. It was the place that everybody went to in the 1970s because the UK and the Western economies generally were doing very badly. It was winter of discontent time. We had high levels of inflation, very high mortgage rates, no economic growth, high unemployment, and all those things. And Iran, after the Shah had tripled the price of oil on Christmas Eve in 1973, was suddenly the land of El Dorado. So everybody was coming. We had royal visits. We had investment bankers, arms salesmen, all sorts of people. And it was also, despite what people have said and written about the Shah's secret police, a pretty free place. It was not constrained in the way that it has been since the Ayatollahs took over.
From, I think, Thursday night, we started to see tweets from people like the former Israeli defense minister, who's now wanted by the ICJ, Yoav Gallant, saying the next few weeks would redefine the shape of the Middle East. Do you think that talk of the next few weeks changing the Middle East is right, though? I mean, or is this something that's going to be, are we in for the long haul?
Do we think that the next few weeks from now are going to be defining in terms of the future of the Middle East? To be honest, we don't know. And one of the reasons why, and people like me wondered whether, leaving aside the legality question, wondered whether this was wise, was that I've seen very little evidence of serious planning in the US machinery of government, if you like, as to what to do the day after. It's one thing with brilliant intelligence and extraordinary military capability to take out Ayatollah Khamenei and a lot of his other senior people. But then what? And I haven't seen much evidence of a clear plan. What we have seen evidence of is that the Iranians have got a whole series of layers of planning for the succession. After all, Khamenei was 86 years old. He was going to die of natural causes, if not of Israeli military strikes sooner or later. So they've been thinking about this for some time. Now, what are they going to do? Are we going to see the continuation of hardline theocracy? He was virtual dictator. Now, he's gone. His son Mujtaba apparently is still alive. He's one of those they talk about as a possible successor. There's Ali Larijani, who is, it seems, on reasonable terms with both pragmatists and the theocratic extremists. And you've got the Revolutionary Guard as an institution, largely decapitated, but with their own interests, their own agenda, which is separate from those of the Ayatollahs. And by the way, what I should add is that, there is no touchy-feely, wonderful, liberal, freedom-loving democratic opposition movement which is ready to step into the breach.
Peter, just explain to us why that is. Describe the structures of power in Iran that make it really hard to just decapitate the regime and allow a vacuum that can be filled by a more liberal option.
Well, there are different layers on the, if you like, the theocratic side. There's the Guardian Council, there's the Council of Regents, there's a series of other groups. They are, if you like, the people who orchestrate elections, vet the candidates so that they don't get somebody being elected who they don't want. And of course, Khamenei, I'm sorry, the names are very similar, himself created his own version of Velayat-e Faqih, which is the kind of doctrinal basis for his power as head of state, and stood it on its head and gave himself more power than the original theologians thought was appropriate. Now, in the future, will it turn out to be that the other key players in the Iranian state think that the theocrats have actually served their purpose? In other words, screwed up, because they've been in power for 46 years, they're corrupt, they're incompetent, they've destroyed the economy, they're wildly unpopular, they're repressive, and they've lived on a diet of death to Israel and death to America, which has brought nothing but death from Israel and death from America. So, it hasn't exactly worked out that well. So, will the Revolutionary Guard, who have been empowered enormously over the years, they cut their teeth originally in the war with Iraq, but they are now very powerful, they are very corrupt, they've got fingers in most of the pies, they've got a lot of money, their children are off in the West having a good time, going skiing and partying up. Are these people going to say, well, you know what, the Ayatollahs have messed this up, we will take control?
Peter, it sometimes feels like Donald Trump doesn't necessarily care about what comes next. We saw that with Venezuela. He removed Maduro, but actually there wasn't actually a big push for democracy. The regime is pretty much carried on as it was. He has hinted that he knows who's coming next.
He says he has been briefed about all of the leadership shakeups inside Iran. He would not say who exactly he believes is running the country right now, but he says, I know exactly who is, I just won't tell you. There are some good candidates, he says, who could lead Iran in the weeks moving forward should discussions pick up. And
is there a chance that he has been having conversations with some of the people who might be in the running on the ground? For example, some of the slightly more moderate, more Western-friendly candidates, like, for example, Hassan Rouhani, who was the former president. I mean, could there be a deal in the offing?
Well, there's Hassan Rouhani, who was under house arrest. There is Mousavi, also under house arrest, another former president. There's President Pezeshkian, who is not dead, who is something of a moderate, but of course a political figure. I think he's a doctor rather than any sort of a theologian. There are people like Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister, who is out on television pretty well all the time. US educated, very good English, former Revolutionary Guard, by the way. Probably not at the moment, top leadership. Do Americans talk to him? For sure. I've seen no evidence that the White House, if you like, have been preparing the ground with a successor. It doesn't mean to say it hasn't been happening. But I suspect you're probably right, Manveen, in saying he doesn't really care. But I see no evidence, I'm afraid, of a plan or indeed of somebody waiting in the wings who is going to suddenly transform Iran into a different sort of society. Of course, there is the son of the former Shah, Reza Pahlavi, who's been in touch with the White House and has put out his own statements, and who I suspect, particularly if he turned out to be a transitional figure rather than, if you like, a new autocrat, would indeed meet with the favor of the United States government. But the problem there is, how do you move him from where he is now, living in Potomac, making nice videos, to being a key political figure in Iran? If you parachute him in from an American aircraft, he'll get kind of shot down by the Revolutionary Guard before he lands.
We should also just address the history here. There are reasons why many Iranians are very suspicious of American intervention. And also, I suppose there's a history of America viewing Iran as, particularly in the security and the intelligence and defense establishment, of viewing Iran as the great enemy. Just remind us a bit about the history.
Well, the United States, like the United Kingdom, has got a lot of regional baggage. The Iranians held us and the Americans responsible for the 1953 coup, which got rid of Mossadegh, the democratically elected prime minister. They hold us all responsible for having encouraged, and they're right, by the way, Saddam Hussein to declare war on the Islamic Republic, which killed probably 1 million Iranians and lasted for 8.5 years until it ended. They're a bit paranoid about the British and the Americans in particular, the big Satan and the little Satan. I remember back in the day when I was around and talking to Iranian students and trying to persuade them that supporting Khomeini was going to produce a worse life rather than life under the Shah. The joke then was, if you raised Khomeini's beard, it had Sachte Inglis, made in England, written on his chin underneath, because they assumed that anything that happened in the Middle East was, a British plot or an American plot. From the American point of view, they've never forgotten the taking of the hostages for 444 days from the American embassy. They've never forgotten 241 US Marines being killed in Beirut by essentially what we call now Iranian proxies in 1983. And that's without, fast forwarding to what Hamas were doing in October of 2022. So without going into all that detail, there is a great deal of suspicion and hostility and a degree of not really understanding either, because the Americans haven't had a diplomat on the ground in Iran since the revolution. I think they've been talking past each other for a long time.
On that, Peter, it does bring us back to the legality of this war. Does this count as a preemptive strike? Was there a legitimate, genuine concern that Iran would be able to hit the US or one of its allies imminently?
Well, I'm not in government. I don't see all the intelligence. In fact, I don't see any of the intelligence. But it did not seem to me that there was an imminent threat of the kind that the British government, anyway, with its attachment to rule of law, thought would justify that kind of preemptive strike. Nor was there action against, UK or US interests or Israeli interests, which required a kind of action in self-defense. They were not about to build nuclear weapons, and nobody seriously is saying that. So I think it's hard to argue that it would meet that test. You do have to look at the issue of rule of law, and we've had to go to the British Parliament. There was a time when I was ambassador in Washington when Obama was thinking of dropping bombs on Syria to deal with the chemical weapons problem. And David Cameron went to the British Parliament. British Parliament said, we don't support this. The issue of legality of military action is something that we always have to look at with great care. And it's very relevant in our case, both in terms of does the UK join in, and, of course, does it mean that the UK's military facilities, which are made available to the United States government, can be used for offensive activity over which we have legal doubts? So it's not a new issue. It's always out there.
When you were British ambassador to Washington, D.C., you will have been part of some of these negotiations. It was during a period when we were still engaged in wars together. Unlike the previous wars, unlike the war in Iraq, for example, the US this time didn't take this to the UN and try and get a resolution. They didn't even take it to Congress. Do you think within America, will there be questions about that?
There have been a number of people, even in the Republican Party, who have said, this is not what we voted for. Marjorie Taylor Greene has been up in arms. Some other brave Republicans have said, this isn't right. It was no more foreign wars was what we voted for. Is it because he's desperate to change the subject from Epstein or from the state of the American economy? I don't know. Congress, I'm afraid, has been supine. It is under the control of the Republican Party, both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Very, very few Republicans have been prepared to stand up for what they would regard as principle or rule of law or the national interest or indeed constitutional propriety because they're too scared. But I think it depends on whether this works or not. What the president likes is quick and easy wins that make him look good and decisive. If, however, it turns out to be a mess with Americans being killed, no regime change, acceleration of the nuclear program by the Iranians because they think this is the only way they can defend themselves against future attacks, then I think it begins to look like this was an exercise in trying to make the president look good, which was not properly thought through in terms of the consequences of the easy bit, which are the military victories of the first couple of days.
And Peter, even militarily, we think of America as the big military superpower. At the same time, there have been warnings that perhaps they're not prepared for the sort of war this might turn into in the region. Tell us a bit about that.
It's very difficult to do this at such a distance and not run out of, equipment, machinery, man-hours, weapons, ammunition, and so on. So I suspect it won't go on for too long. But it will have had a rather scaring effect on the small countries in the region, who, instead of looking to America to look after their security, is going to see that American action has actually damaged their security. We have to hope that other things like the Houthis' decision that they're closing the Red Sea to shipping, which may be more bluster than a real military threat. We have to hope that those kind of threats and disruption to international trade and shipping and so on are short-lived or not as serious as they may sound.
We know that there have been warnings from within the military. We understand people have been sacked for warning that they are not ready for the sort of engagement that a proper war with Iran would take. I hear that one of the big carriers in the region, which is now actually trying to protect Israel, the USS Gerald Ford, actually has a huge sanitation problem. They don't have enough loos on board, and there are 50-minute queues, and everything has gone very wrong. Presumably they're near Israel, so maybe they get loo breaks, I'm not sure. But there are many reasons why it feels like this is not necessarily sustainable as a long operation. They are also huge floating targets. For a president who didn't want to risk American lives, is there a danger that this could go very badly for Donald Trump?
Yeah, the vision of thousands of soldiers standing there with their legs crossed on the USS Gerald Ford is a rather sort of horrific one for things. But of course, that carrier has been at sea for much longer than was scheduled. So, we have some sympathy for the poor guys who are on board. If you remember, Ayatollah Khamenei said 10 days ago or so, you may think that you can drop a lot of bombs on us, but we've got the ability to send your aircraft carriers to the bottom of the ocean. Was that bluster or was that something else? The military people I've spoken to say they've definitely managed to significantly improve their ballistic missile capability. Do they have ballistic missiles of such capability that they can hit an American aircraft carrier with all the carrier protection group and the anti-missile defenses that it's got around it? I don't know. One general I spoke to said, yes, they have. Another said, no, they haven't. But I think what would change the whole game is if it turned out, and there's no evidence this is happening, but it's been talked about a little bit, the Chinese were going to provide some of their hypersonic missiles to the Iranians with which they probably could attack a major surface vessel of the US Navy. So they must have calculated all this, and I suspect that one reason why the possibility of military attack 2 or 3 weeks ago did not come to fruition and it was delayed until this weekend was that they wanted to be very sure that they got maximum defensive capability in place through those 2 aircraft carriers and all the other aircraft and machinery and ground-to-air missile defenses that they have installed over the last few weeks.
Since we spoke to Peter, US Central Command has announced that 3 US service members have been killed in action. 5 others have been seriously wounded. And just finally, Peter, all the hostilities started late Friday, early Saturday. The markets haven't been open so far. They open on Monday. We know the Straits of Hormuz are already being closed, which will affect oil prices. It'll have a huge impact on the markets, could have an impact on us all. The only thing we really know about Donald Trump and his decision-making in the past, he's not always very ideological, but the one thing that we do know is the markets do matter. People say taco. Trump always chickens out when the markets start to move. Has he bitten off more than he can chew? If the markets do look catastrophic early this week, it's not something he can immediately back out of.
No, and you're right, Straits of Hormuz, probably 25% of the world's seabound oil and gas, LNG, go through that waterway. Some tankers are getting through, is what I'm hearing. It's not completely closed. But there must be a risk that when the markets open, the price of oil goes up. And other markets, I would have thought, would be somewhat spooked by this. And indeed, the impression that he is a great economic genius who is doing great things to the American economy, if all that is under threat, then that will cause him to think again.
Are you optimistic about what comes next?
I'm a little apprehensive because I don't detect a plan for a better Iran. And we do not know enough about how the powers that be are going to respond. I'm also thinking of Iran's capacity for destabilizing the region, which is quite significant, even though the Israelis and the Americans have done a fantastic amount of damage to their capacity to do that, whether it's by decapitating Hezbollah or Hamas or the Syrian regime. There's still scope for them to make a lot of trouble. Or might we have a more pragmatic approach, whether it is a clerical one or whether it is a more pragmatic, if you like, self-serving revolutionary guard taking charge and seeing that it's in their interest to have a more prosperous country and to, ideologically, if you like, trim the nature of the revolution and engage pragmatically with the rest of the world. That is possible. What is not very likely, I'm sorry to say, is a kind of liberal Western touchy-feely democratic republic based on rule of law and freedom of expression and a free press. I don't see that happening anytime soon. I would love it to be the case. Iran is a country of extraordinary human capital, great natural wealth, tremendous civilization, great history, deserves so much better. But I'm apprehensive. The reason I can't say to you I'm optimistic, I'm apprehensive because I don't see a plan that necessarily leads to something better.
That was Sir Peter Westmacott, former British ambassador to the US, who started his overseas career in Iran. And before him, Gabrielle Weiniger, the Times Israel correspondent, speaking to us from Tel Aviv. The producers today were Olivia Case and Sophie McNulty. The executive producer was Tim Walklate. Sound design was also by Sophie McNulty, and our theme composition was by Mal Lassetto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.